Hello and good morning and welcome to our webinar on land-led schemes. Joining me to start is Andrew Markham, one of the SDS directors. Hello, good morning, Andrew. How are you today?
Good morning, Christopher. Yes, I'm very well, very good. Looking forward to today's session, actually. Yeah, really excited about today. Be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've got Steve Aleppo, who's the Finance Director, Investment and Commercial of Sovereign, as well as Steve Trenwith, who's the Land and Planning Director. And they've been doing a lot of extremely sophisticated things in their approach and their story. So I've seen their presentation. I think it's great. And I've no doubt there's going to be a huge amount of engagement on that. But why did you want us to focus on land-led?
Well, I think my background, as people know, is been a land buyer. So I've worked in the private sector for a number of years before coming to SDS. And I think obviously our clients in SDS now are more looking at land-led schemes or proportion of that. So it'd be interesting to see how many out there of our clients are actually doing land-led and what questions they have. But it's a complete different challenge than looking at Section 106. And it's a interesting actually when you break it down. I know we've got Duncan here today as well, that we've done kind of land buying, and if you look at the layers that's involved, it's quite incredible. And I think people don't kind of really realize the work that needs to be put in the front end and during the planning process, and have, you know, a bit more kind of strategic view of where you're kind of looking at your products and where you're going to source your land and how that is going to go through the process. So I think it's a massive topic. We won't get to everything, but it'd be interesting to see from people who are actually doing it on the ground, how they've done it from a housing association world, and maybe in later webinars we can tap in some of the private clients that I know and we know, that we can kind of see it from their perspective, because it is a lot of detail there. So we're going to kind of hopefully get some of the key points and see what's happened on the ground. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Andrew. Now, to begin with, we're going to do some polling. We have 5 polling questions, and the idea of this is just to gauge some sentiment on how people are feeling about land-led schemes and what extent of their current involvement is. That we have over 100 attendees today from a huge cross-section of local authorities and housing associations, so this should be pretty good. And also just some housekeeping before we get into the polling and then move on with the rest of things. We want this to be as engaging as possible. I'm monitoring the questions the whole time. I'm seeing each one of them, and I will get back to all of you and get to them. So throw them in as we go. We're going to go out to one Steve A and Steve T, as I will refer to them, finish their presentation. We're going to open it up to the panel. John Stevens is one of our star consultants, and Duncan Smith, who's the commercial director of Walsall Housing Group, is a very spirited chap, I think we can agree, who I'm also looking forward to any crackers he might be giving us. To begin with, let's go into the first poll. So if everyone could tell us, please, are you currently involved in land-led schemes? And we're collecting responses. Okay. Right, 13% voted, 25%. Let's just try, and if you wouldn't mind voting, please. That way, once we get to that, once 80% of you voted, I can move on from this one. Okay, we're getting there, we're getting there. Okay, good, thank you very much. Right, I'm gonna close this one down. So,
wow,
most of us here are involved in land-led schemes already.
Great, they're the experts.
Absolutely, lots of engagement here. Next one. Do you feel able to compete against the private sector in land-led schemes? This is totally anonymous. I don't see who said what. So this hopefully, you know, if you don't feel like you can compete, you can say that in total anonymity on this one. Okay, so far 4% of people have voted on this one, so not on fire. Okay, right. Okay, well, I'm starting to see why the reluctance was, because this is fairly overwhelming now.
Is the answer no? Interesting.
You're waiting and see.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see any kind of follow-up questions actually on that, and
Yeah,
poke
well,
questions of why,
okay.
and then
So I'm
perhaps
going to
we can
pose this
tackle
one at
those.
75% of people have voted.
Okay. No,
Yeah, no,
it'd be interesting to see Duncan's view and John's view on that.
absolutely. So we're going to try and solve that one. Next one. Do you think an increase in S106 bidders is driving up pricing artificially? Andrew, would you like to elaborate on this as people sort of cast their poll?
Well, it was just me thinking about, the advent of more local authorities kind of now, it seems, bidding on Section 106 stance. Has people seen that this is driving up the price? So local authorities can be probably a bit more aggressive in their offers, and there's lots of private companies coming in, LNG for one example, doing deals with private sector. So just to see your view really on if this is actually happening for you.
Okay, 30% voted. If anyone is out there, could you please vote if you're listening to this, so that we can move on to the next one. Okay, 49%, 54%. Okay, people are voting. All right, let this one run just a little bit more, and we're going to close in a few seconds. Okay, I think I'll close this now. Yep, it's about 70%. We'll close out.
Okay.
Right.
Yes. Well.
That's a pretty again, that's a consent, that's a majority for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, I'm going to do an infographic on this and I'm going to distribute it afterwards. That's why that'll probably be quite good. Okay, so we've got two left now, so please bear with us, and this will hopefully frame our conversation.
Definitely.
How long do your land-led schemes take from inception to planning approval? And Andrew, if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
And it was just, again, just a view on, this is more not really looking at the build development phase. This is looking about when you identify a site or you've identified you want to get a site in this said location, how would you do it and how long does it take? My experience is some of these sites can take longer than 18 months, but it was just giving a view of how's it looking for you and have you got an appetite for that? And then we will talk about, I'm sure we'll be talking about risks of land-led schemes.
Absolutely. We've got 29% voted now, 31%. If you could please vote, that would be fantastic for us all. We could all benefit from this shared knowledge and just try and understand what the norms are. Okay, 58%, 60%, 65%. We're keeping up to 70%. Thank you everyone so much for participating like this. We very much appreciate it. And okay, I'm gonna close this poll now and show you the results.
Okay, so 12 to 18 months comes out the top.
Yeah, that's what most people are sort of going for.
Okay.
Okay. And now we have one question left. Okay, this is the big one. Now you can select multiple ones of these. What's the thing that you think is going to help you compete the most? Which tool here in your arsenal is the one? We have grant funding, policy, planning, and CPO powers, compulsory purchasing powers. Obviously, only the local authorities have that one, which could give them a huge advantage. Okay, 15, 18, 19, 20%. If we could, this is it. Just this last one, and we can get into the content on a more informed basis. 40%, if everyone can please participate in this, we can finish it and move on. Okay, just a little bit more there. 60% of you voted. Okay, good, good. That's pushing up now. Okay, cool. Great. All right, I'm going to close the poll now. A few seconds left. All right, closing the poll. Look at that.
Grant funding. Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
Okay.
Planning. Okay.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
and 17% local authority.
Perhaps we will share this to the Homes England.
Yeah, I mean, if they want to come on, they would love to, but they don't seem to want to. So,
There's an invitation there. Come on to our webinars.
Always open and always will be.
Okay.
Right, okay. I'm going to ask Steve Aleppo and Steve Trenwith to please switch on their cameras. And Andrew, if you could hide your face, please, and I will. And Steve Aleppo, I'm going to make you a presenter. And morning. Okay, so Steve Trenwith, I think I've introduced you as the Land and Planning Director of Sovereign. Steve Aleppo, Commercial Finance Director, Commercial and Investment of Sovereign. And Steve, if you could share your screen. Perfect. It's all over to you guys. And everyone, please, as the questions roll through, I'm watching them and I'm, of course, still here. So over to you two.
Thank you, Christopher. Just a quick intro. My name's Steve Trenwith. I'm the Land and Planning Director at Sovereign. My background's pretty heavily house builder, about 30 years before I came over to Sovereign a couple of years ago, starting as a site engineer and then moving over into land and planning about 25 years ago. Steve.
Morning, I'm Steve Aleppo. I'm the Director for Investment and Commercial Finance at Sovereign. I've been here about 3 years, and prior to that, I've spent the best part of 20 years working in housing, mainly in development finance and business planning. I spent the bulk of my career at the Hyde Group, and yeah, still enjoying being in the sector.
Thanks, Steve. So I think looking at understanding the risks of land-led, the first point I think to get into is maybe the most important part is for the business to identify that it really wants to start off on this land-led part of the journey. So as part of that, Sovereign identified within its corporate strategy, one of the pillars of it was more homes and better places. And I think this move to land-led, it does impact on the wider business, and so it has to be led from the top. And then once the business had made that decision, and the development team then picked up the baton, and we set out a development strategy for, it was the 2019 to 24 one, and setting out how land would sit within a system that really was set up for dealing with the delivery of mostly 106 schemes. And we looked at the fact that we might have to do the difficult. I think we've said, can we compete against the private sector? Having had my background there, I realised if we were going to deal with a bread and butter house builder site, we might struggle. So we might have to look at things which have maybe longer lead-in times, more complex to look at. So we identified that that was something we'd have to look at. We also identified that we might want to start working on joint ventures. So very early on in the stage, we got into joint ventures with Vistry, David Wilson and Crest. The Crest one being almost 1,000 units over at Bristol. Because actually from doing those joint ventures, we learned from others about some of the pitfalls of land-led, rather than ourselves sort of stumbling around in the dark straight away. Steve.
Sorry, Steve, do you want me to go on to the next slide?
Yes, please, thanks.
Great. Okay, so just from a finance perspective, laying the groundwork to support the land-led strategy at Sovereign. As I said, I came in January 2019, and I understood around the same time as Steve Trenwith and Tom Titherington, who's the group development director. And I guess we were all brought in with Sovereign already, just having been through a merger. And having, been a really significant size organisation, so approaching 60,000 homes and delivering between about 1,000 and 1,500 units a year, but still internally at Sovereign feeling like it was maybe not pushing itself as hard as it could and making the impact that it wanted to make. So they'd already decided that they were going to, they wanted to pivot towards more of a land-led strategy to really bring the vision for the homes and the services that we were going to provide to life. But they also understood that they needed to bring in people who maybe had seen that happening elsewhere and would be able to come in and work with the very, very good team that was already in place at Sovereign, but just supplement that and maybe help the organisation to move with a bit more confidence towards the future that it was hoping to achieve. So one of the first things that I needed to do when I came in was to work closely with Steve and Tom and to have a look at our the capacity of the business and its finances to work out just what was a realistic aspiration for the scale that we could grow this the whole development program to, but also the land-led program within it, and how would we calibrate that land-led program in terms of tenure mix, in terms of location, and in terms of working out how we would build up both in the short term but also in the long term. So we did some early stage planning that really helped us to understand what the impact of our next steps would be, and in terms of complying with our lenders' covenants and our golden rules, in terms of fitting or even actually pivoting and pushing back on the organisation's risk appetite, and just making sure that the board was clear about the risks that were involved and we were clear about how much risk the board was really willing to take. We needed to look closely at the subsidiaries, so the group structure and the way that funds would flow around the group to enable us to enter into contract and to transact on these deals in the most tax efficient way that would then capture and maintain most value for us, or maximize the value that we were capturing, which we can then plow back into the homes and services that we want to provide, while also protecting ultimately the housing association from the risks which Andrew was describing at the outset, which are fairly materially different to risks that we were running before on Section 106. We had also just entered into a strategic partnership agreement with Homes England, where in the current bid round, so the one that's due to end in 2025, we secured a large allocation in partnership with Live West. So we already understood the amounts of grant that we were getting and how we might be able to channel that in as an element of the funding that was going to make our land-led plans viable. And then we also needed to make sure that we took our stakeholders, so in particular our lenders and credit rating agencies and our board, and I suppose also just internally as well, just really make sure that people understood what we were trying to do and why we were trying to do it. So we needed to be able to tell quite a simple story, making clear that there was change involved, but also making clear that it was a change that was entirely consistent with what the organisation ultimately was saying that it was here to do. Back to kind of making it work from a finance perspective. So we had some fairly flat hurdle rates when I turned up at Sovereign. The organisation had a go at changing those hurdle rates, but they were in the early stages of bedding in, and I think it's fair to say there were a few problems. We were seeing some counterintuitive results from using them, so we had another look at that and changed the measures that we were using and changed the way that we calibrated those measures as well. So two things we were trying to do there mainly. One was to I suppose take account of the risks, or make it slightly more sophisticated to cater for the different levels of risk in different types of scheme. But also we saw the hurdles as being a really useful strategic tool, where we could actually incentivize a development team that until then had been largely used to and was finding it maybe easier to compete and win Section 106 deals, to actually incentivizing them to bring forward those harder and often more expensive land-led deals. So that was an important move, and I think it's fair to say that that's, especially in the last year, that's a journey that we are still on and trying to get right, but we've definitely got some traction by adopting that approach. Also more sophisticated stress testing. So early on we entered into a large joint venture with Crest. That was the biggest joint venture Sovereign had done in years and years, perhaps ever actually, and in order to get our board comfortable with that, we had to develop a much more robust suite of stress tests, scenarios and sensitivities than they'd seen before, and we've carried that forward as a template for assessing and making sure that we understand what could go wrong with land-led deals, and we understand the headroom that we've got for those things to happen. At the deal level, we're seeing, in terms of the differences from Section 106, far more complexity in terms of how you think about structuring those deals. So we're looking at doing things directly. We're looking at structural LLPs to where we might go in 50-50 with a developer, both in terms of debt and equity, and a say on how the development happens. Or we might look for a looser structure and try and agree a bespoke profit share with a partner. So again, that drives a lot more complexity, but it's really interesting as well. Counterparty risk. So when we go into these deals, I guess the key point with land-led is that the risk, I think Steve's about to say more of this in a sec, but the risks are a lot greater, and the risk around, you really need to understand who you're dealing with and the kind of things that could go wrong and what happens if they do go wrong, and you need to understand that and try and protect yourself against that from the outset. So we're now putting a lot more focus and weight upon really understanding our counterparties, building good relationships with them, and making sure that we are as clear on the risks and the protections as we can be at the outset. And then back to what it means for the finance and the finance team in particular. So more complexity, definitely. And while we had a really good team when I arrived here, many of whom we've kept, we did need more capacity, and we needed to both develop the skills of the existing team, but also supplement that by creating new roles and bringing in people from other sectors, and people who could add to what we already were able to do. So the kind of things that we've needed and we're adding and still trying to add are financial modelling. So when I first came into the sector 20 years ago, this was kind of pre-Proval, and it was pre-Pamwin, really. I suppose that those tools were out there, but at Hyde we were using spreadsheets. So from day one, I had to work out I had to learn how to build an appraisal from scratch in a spreadsheet. And looking back, especially now with dealing with private developers and having to take their models apart or even build bespoke models that cater for different types of risk, that's a really useful skill, and I'm not sure how far that skill is still in the sector. I don't know how many people in the sector have that today, as we've been driven more towards Section 106 and plug and play solutions. So that's a challenge that we've been trying to address. Tax definitely is something that across the whole of our finance team we're trying to make sure that we can that we've got the knowledge that we need, and we've got access to third-party knowledge where things get a bit more challenging, and it's available to Steve and his team when they want to do deals. Risk assessment as well. So in finance, we absolutely need to be able to answer the right questions, not just pose problems, but also try to come up with solutions so we can support our development colleagues to ultimately we all want these deals to happen, but they need to happen on the right terms. Working with third parties and getting their forecasts in, I constantly get asked by my board to tell them what's happening on our joint ventures, but typically the joint venture partner is handling the forecasting and they all have their own templates and their own ways of doing it. So that's driven the need for us to create our standardized templates and work with those partners to make sure that we can quickly assimilate those forecasts into a sovereign view of the world. And from a reporting perspective, the complexity that I've described, actually, that could then translate to very complex reporting, up to management, up to board. Ultimately, if we're not distilling that complexity and making it simple and picking out the key points, we're not doing our jobs. So again, a real need for crisp reporting, and that's really on us in finance to make that happen. And so what does that mean in terms of the kind of people who I need in my team and who we need to be? So we need to be really commercially savvy. We need for Steve and his team to feel like we're good to work with and that we can both do the soft skills, but we've also got the technical skills that they can rely on. And we need ultimately people who get and want to do development. And they don't grow on trees. So there is an element whereby we've got to go and find those people and really, create some excitement about what we're trying to do. And I think just to one thing I'll leave on there, which is, across the sector, I mean, even I've been a group finance director for housing associations, and I've been around this sector for a long time, but I'll be very honest and say that there is still some stuff moving to land-led at Sovereign, which I'm having to learn all the time myself. And I think you need to be quite humble about that. There is a big risk of pretending you know something that you don't know. And there's a big risk that sometimes, especially with some of the terminology, people think they understand what each other are saying, but actually they don't. And so I think we need to be really kind of honest about that, and we'll go a lot faster if we can, I guess, get clear lines of communication going. I'm going to go on to the next slide, Steve, and turn my mic off.
Thank you, Steve. I mean, coming back to land, so we've got the business in a better shape now to understand what's happening, and then the business needs to be aware of what the normal risks are associated with land buying, rather than those maybe with 106, where the developer retains the lion's share of the risk. So legal due diligence, you need to look long and hard at your legal team and your advisors to make sure they have the skill sets. Are they the right people to have giving you advice? Are they the right people to have you representing you? They may be very competent on 106. They may be out of their depths when it comes to complex legal structures associated particularly with joint ventures, but also with land purchase. Planning risk. The classic here is really we've often got fantastic relationships with the local authority, mostly through the housing team, but often at chief exec level. And then suddenly you start putting planning applications through and you find they're not really your friends anymore. So again, lessons learned for the business. When planning is coming through, politics truly comes into play, and you've got to understand that and be aware of that, and potentially be very robust as well. Technical, the big one here is getting out of the ground. Usually, obviously on large, complex, multi-story projects, there are a lot of issues out of the ground, but on a housing scheme, it's all about contamination, getting that foundation design, drainage solutions and services sorted out. And again, building yourself good, getting yourself a good group of people around you to support you on that. And then on larger sites where you don't want to be running an all affordable scheme, getting comfortable with the risks around open market sales. And it is a big step change up from the risks on shared ownership. And the last bit, which was new to me, which is governance. So the governance surrounding land buying, particularly as a registered provider, we've got to report to regulator, and we've got constraints on us, quite rightly, of how we're dealing with public money. not been an issue for the 30 years leading up, where if I could prove the bottom line was looking pretty good, pat on the back, crack on. So the really important bit then is really to move on to identifying and building a good team around you. And strengthening the team was a key thing that we had to do. And, you know, there's the obvious ones with land managers. We've started getting strategic land in there and planners, but also the financial analysts, making sure we've got the support from Steve's team to help us with that. But also one of our regional heads of development came over to my team to help be a lead and head my joint venture team. And that makes us a partner with others. And we've also now started building a technical and build team, and we're never going to build ourselves, but it again makes us a better client. And we're leading in now into getting our heads around the commercial side of things. And then really moving forward, you know, we've got to ourselves where we've got to the moment with our teams, but we're starting to mature a little bit now. So we've been working on a home and place standard. This is going to be helping qualify and quantify our existing stock, but also making sure that the new developments are developments fit for the future and what we want, and be a bit more driven and you could say picky on the sort of schemes we want to go forward. The next step for us is we're embarking on getting a standard house type range. This is to reduce the risk. Once you're out of the ground, you know what you've got. Then if you're out of the ground and you're doing a large block of flats, then you can concentrate on there. But the day-to-day housing, you're more comfortable with. Our strategic asset grading model that we're undertaking to look at our existing stock, that's going to drive where we're going to look. And that may take us into more uncomfortable areas where naturally we might not be going to, but you know, we are going to want to keep the level of properties we've got, even if we are disposing of properties. And then getting ourselves comfortable doing more complex work. So some of you might realize, have understood that we've bought Clifton Shopping Centre. We bought it as a long-term mixed-use redevelopment. But the development team worked very closely with Steve A's team just to ensure that this site, first and foremost, works as an investment. We had to get our feet firmly on the ground, and then with an eye to take it forward, basically to secure a really good bit of real estate in a great part of Bristol. Thank you. I think that's enough from me. I think happy to hand back to Christopher for any questions.
Hello, and thank you so much. We really appreciate it. If I could call on the panel, please. And if everyone can please switch their webcams on, that would be brilliant. So firstly, thank you so much, Steve A and Steve T. That was absolutely fantastic. And we've already got a huge amount of engagement here. I'm sorry for everyone who's having problems watching the webinar. I think GoToWebinar is not functioning properly, so sorry about that. I've had a few emails and messages. Right, so to begin with, David Gibson, we seem to be able to compete in the low value areas, but only for affordable schemes. Thank you for that, David. And we have Harry Hodge, as we know her, Harry, from Two Rivers, who said, no, we can't compete against the private sector on the more desirable sites. However, as an RP, our expertise is in the smaller, trickier sites, such as rural exception sites. Just a little clarification here from Sheila, our events coordinator and trainer. Homes England have agreed to be in future webinars with us.
Oh, great.
I cannot wait. That's going to be brilliant. Look out for the date on that one.
Me. I'm coming.
Yeah. Oh no. Yeah, don't let Duncan on there. Thumbnail.
I've got a question here for Steve. I'm not sure which Steve, but can Steve elaborate? And this is from Shaheen Inam. Can Steve elaborate on how their partnerships worked with developers? Do they help advise on sale units? What's the benefit to the developer to work with housing associations?
On some of the large, let's be honest, I worked for national house builders for 25 of my 30 years, and they don't always play nicely with others, should we say. The main reason, let's be blunt, that they entered into it was cash. Let's they wanted some of our money offers, but we made it abundantly clear. And this is where, let's just say I spent 6 years at Barclay Group, 6 years at Persimmon. The more robust side of my personality built over those years came out to make sure that our partners understood that it was a partnership, and we were going to set up the first ones we did were LLP, so there's a board structure, and that we would be sitting on the board and ensuring that our delivery partner, who were reporting into the board, were being held to account. We do it with good humour and politely, but we are robust. And you think you've just got to know when you're going into these that that's what you want to do. And if you do it well and do it correctly and collegiately, then you can steer the schemes to get something where you're going. You've always got to understand your partner's looking to the bottom line at all times. But actually, you can steer to get, look at placemaking and make sure that the properties you're getting are ones that, not only meet our RP aspirations, but our wider development aspirations.
Thank you very much, Steve. Duncan, going straight to you.
Not like me to come in with some strong views, Chris, but I'm gonna. Do you know what? No names, no pouches. So let's not talk about organisations, but the development industry generally is unashamed about making profit, and I have absolutely no problem with that whatsoever because I know they are. Therefore, my relationship with that via 106 or buying something from them, no problem. They're going to make profit on. I'm okay. When I'm entering into a joint venture with any other, it's a different relationship. We're both making profit. And we're both putting things into that. That might be expertise, it might be land, it might be money. But for me, the important thing in a joint venture is setting out what each individual organisation's aims and aspirations are and agreeing those up front, right? Because if you don't do that, then the rows happen when you're delivering stuff down the line. So if you're really clear that somebody's going into it with this aim and objective, and our aims and objectives are also dealt with and they're documented, because that's the important thing as well, is everybody goes in with happy cheer, oh yeah, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, and then 2 minutes later somebody reverts to type. So document, live by it, and then manage it properly for those aims and objectives and the outcomes, and you're absolutely fine and dandy. Don't, and you end up in real problems and falling out with people, and that's never what we want to do to take forward on a joint venture.
Thank you very much, Duncan. Back to Steve Aleppo.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I think certainly for joint ventures over the last year, especially since lockdown, that point around being really clear that we're partners has become even more important because we haven't been able to go and meet in person. We haven't been on the site, and actually, in terms of our fortunes, some of the house builders, at least for the first 6 to 9 months of the pandemic, probably saw their fortunes turning down, and certainly the share prices suffering in a way that maybe we as housing associations didn't. So I think that created potential for a gap in drivers in terms of what their businesses wanted relative to when we went into partnership versus where we were at the start. And so that's something that I think we have to just be cognizant of as well and really manage actively.
Can I pose a question? There's a question. Thanks, Steve, for those presentations. It's very good. What I want to ask is, what failed in your process, and how did you manage that? What was the key thing? We've got a lot of people on here who are doing land-led schemes, maybe for the first time. So you've come across some failures. We all got to kind of live by that as land buyers, and some schemes work, some's not. So what failed, and how did you manage it, and what can we take from that? And I give that to Steve and Duncan and John as well. So it'd be interesting.
Thanks, Andrew. Just before that, could everyone who's not speaking please mute their microphone because we're getting feedback, and when you talk, unmute. That would be brilliant. Thank you very much. And was that back to Steve, Andrew?
Yeah, let's go first. Let's go to Steve T first. Yep.
Steve T.
I think one of the things, before we even get site specific, and one of the issues where we weren't set up in governance to deal properly with the land-led coming through and hold to scrutiny. It was weird. I found myself both poacher and gamekeeper on my own sites because actually, we were looking at sites and doing scrutiny on sites, and everyone was shouting at the mouse in the corner, and meanwhile there's a huge elephant sitting over on the right, because they did not understand the risk that might be around, say, an access problem getting into a site. So they were shouting about, oh, that margins and look tight over there. I'm going, doesn't really matter. We might not have a site at all if we don't set out, get the access sorted. So that was one of the major problems, was actually an education internally of those holding people to account on what they need to be doing. And I think the biggest problem, I think, has actually been one of when you do a Section 106 deal, pretty well 99.9% of the times that deal then happens, and then it's delivered pretty well in line with whatever the developer's doing. Obviously with COVID, it's been different. The understand the business was we said, this is a site, this is when we think it's going to happen, and it got nailed into the business as if that's happening. And then strangely, these strange people on planning committees have a different view, or the planners decide it's really hard working in COVID, so it's going to take them 6 months to do something that they should take a month to turn around. And that was one of the, so I don't think we've had any disasters on site specifically, because we have done huge due diligence on them, but actually it's more the fact that they don't, you've got to understand that land-led doesn't mean that things happen on the day that you put in your plan. And that's been really difficult, I think, for the RP to get their heads around. So when they hear about me wanting to put 120, 130% cover in a year, the problem is they go, but that means we're going to breach our covenants on that year. I'm going, no, we're not, because tell you now, I'll be lucky to get back to 100% by the time the slippage is going to happen. So that's been part of the problem.
Duncan?
Oh God, I could take an hour on this subject alone. I agree with Steve. I think in our wonderful sector, which is wonderful, governance is the single biggest impediment to moving like the private sector. We can't do it. We can't do it as nimbly as they can, because we have different things to meet. We have different processes, different boards, etc. So I suppose what I wrote down when we were thinking about this was nimble, and also I suppose the phrase sweet spots. We are not going to compete with house builders on anything, from my organisation's perspective, north of 100 homes, right? Their setup, their technical teams, their procurement, I could go on and on and on, right? We're not going to do that. So where's our sweet spot? And I suggest our sweet spot is somewhere between 30 and 80. That works quite nicely. We've got to be able to react commercially to the opportunity. So if it's out for a bid, or if it's an off-market opportunity, then we've got to act quickly to make sure that is reacted to, because we're not going to change the timescales. So you've got to do the work to get into a position to do it, and therefore you've got to set governance up beforehand to make sure that you can meet those timescales. And if you haven't got it, you're not doing it, because somebody else will do it, no problem whatsoever. So you've got to have that thought. And also for me, it's about competitive advantage. And I was really interested to hear the poll earlier about, can we compete with the private sector? My answer to that question is yes. Yes, we can, but on different bases. So for example, I don't know, Steve, you'll bear me out here. A national house builder profit margin, probably 25% of GDV, or depending on what the structure is. From our perspective, can we take a lower margin? So we take a lower margin, we control the Section 106 delivery on our own site, because we're poacher and gamekeeper there, and we make sure that we're friends with the local authority as much as we possibly can to get our planning application a smoother ride than maybe somebody in the private sector. Now, a combination of those things, paying for land up front is also a big thing, because house builders generally try to defer their payments to post X, Y, and Z. We've all been there. All these ideas are well-trodden paths. And I think the point about Steve A's presentation around having that finance and development savvy set of people together, right? So that development people can say how it needs to happen for the commercial world, and finance people can take that commercial stuff and put it back into the treasury world, which is really important, and making sure boards are all comfortable with golden rules and all that sort of. That's the absolute key. You get those people working together closely, it happens. And it looks like, we got presentation from these guys here today. They work closely together. It really works. So that's my thoughts. I shall pass on to Mr. Stevens, who's far more intelligent and erudite than me.
John, we haven't heard you today. It's about time.
Called John Smith today. I don't know why we called John Smith.
I don't know why I'm called John Smith. No.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. And
English
thanks, Duncan
English.
Smith. Yeah, brothers. Yeah, there we go. I've been absorbed by the presentation of what's been presented from Sovereign, and I echo what Duncan says about the connection between finance and development and getting that synchronicity working together. I'm hearing about partnerships, I'm hearing about joint ventures, I'm hearing about engagement with the private sector. What I'm interested in is engagement with the local authorities, because we at STS do a lot of work encouraging the growth of development within local authorities, the emerging development aspirations within local authorities. And I see that as a very fertile ground. Having worked with housing associations for years, I see it as a very fertile ground for housing associations and providers to actually start sharing those skills, because you're almost in the middle position between the local authority and the private sector, where the RPs currently are. And I just want to hear a bit about not just stepping forward into the private sector, but maybe engaging in a joint venture with the local authority, because they need the skills, they need the confidence, and they may trust you more than they trust a private house builder. So I'd like to hear about that, please.
Okay, who would like to go on that?
Sovereign and West Berkshire have recently entered into a joint venture. So I would say that it's been an interesting journey. We have our governance, the local authority have their own governance. We found officers being superb. We've actually found members being superb. Unfortunately, the hoops that they have to go to make us look like greased gazelles going through the governance. But we're in. My joint venture, head of joint ventures, sits on the board with them on that, and we've got our first sites going through planning at the moment. So again, it will be fascinating to see how the planning department deal with our first two sites coming through. But yes, absolutely, we identify, especially in one of our stock transfer areas, great relationship, and it made absolute sense. The local authority hold land, adjacent to land that we own, and we're working together on land in the area. So a really good point.
Okay, and I have another question, which is, have you moved away from defaulting to design build contracts? Are you going back to traditional contracts in terms of procurement, or do you default to design and build with land-led schemes?
Good question.
Yeah, good question. So we are at the moment doing a huge amount of work. So we have a new build director brought on board, and he is doing an absolute root and branch at the moment on that, and engaging with contractors that we work with. We've got people who've looked after us brilliantly well over the years. Frankly, if they'd been more commercial, they could have really fleeced us, because we didn't have the in-house knowledge to challenge and push back. We now have a bit more of that. They're finding the discussions more robust. I think we will constantly want to probably have the detailed design outsourced still. I think bringing those skill sets inside are going to be too complex. But we're steering away from JCT, heading a bit more towards development agreements, gives greater flexibility of delivery, and also the ability for us to, especially with the homes and place standard and a new standard house type range, to drive those through outside those constraints. But as soon as you go outside a constraint, you then put yourself potentially more risk, so you have to manage it well.
Thank you. I just got this in from David Gibson. We act as the main contractor with our own site manager. Do others do that? And obviously on selected sites, not all of them. I think that's for Duncan. Duncan?
Yeah, just segueing back into John's two questions and then answering the last one. I laughed when you asked the question, John, because you know what I'm going to say. For me, it's about bang for your buck and about time, right? If you've got somebody at a local authority, again, no names, no pack drill, who knows what they're doing and wants to drive stuff forward, they're like manna from heaven, right? Get involved with that local authority, stuff happens. If you've got a more traditional approach, then it's literally running through treacle or whatever other analogy you want to draw. And then you're saying, right, I've got really difficult program timescales. As much as I want to help, especially on land I may get first preference on, so not for any less value, by the way, let's be really clear, just first preference on. Do I want to take 2 years, or shall I go and buy something slightly more expensive from the private sector I can turn around in 6 months? And that's my evaluation process. Now, I'm not saying we wouldn't work with a local authority. Of course we would work with a local authority, but it would have to be headed up by somebody sensible. Right. Secondly, moving on to procurement. I mean, literally, I think the mixed economy is where we're at. In certain cases, it's going to be right to go and D&B, but sometimes where it's complicated or actually where we need to take the risk to make it happen, I think it is essential that we in the sector change our approach. But again, we've got to educate in terms of the governance around that and what that means for our risk profile. And I think that's the tricky barrier, is again, we're breaking new ground, if you'll forgive the obvious pun, on getting people in governance positions to understand how that risk profile moves. Last point, God, I can't even remember that I was talking about it, is around probably contract management or to that effect. And I think, again, we are incumbent to think about it. You know, there's a couple of ways of doing it. You either bring in a team to contract manage or even go into a subsidiary sort of house builder contractor type organisation, which is also feasible and possible. And I think as we go forward and as we get bigger as a sector, we'll probably need to do that, because we will end up in a position of not having enough in the private sector to be able to go to all the time to do all of our work. So we'll have to create our own contractors to feed our own programs. But I don't think we're there quite yet as a sector. Sorry for talking a lot. Got through it as quickly as I could.
No, not at all. Thank you very much, Duncan. Andrew?
I just wanted a different question, actually. Option agreements. Are you guys doing that? How's that risk profile working? Because not all come to fruition. And are you able to take the long view on an option agreement? And are the housing associations starting to? Well, I know they are starting to move that, but what's your view on it?
I think housing associations are absolutely ideal people to be looking at longer term, because they think longer term.
Yeah.
You know, my background is immediate land. I don't have the patience for strategic land, but I've brought on board a very, very good strategic land manager into the business, joined 6 months ago, already seeing dividends, and looking at entering into options. Again, interesting conversations with the business about the fact that you roll the dice a little bit. The key one is, you know, but forget about the single roll the dice. You may miss this local plan period, but it'll go into the next one. So yeah. I think getting the business to understand about the long term and the patience for it was the easy bit. The difficult bit is you know, we might have to write this off. What we haven't got the answer to yet, we have to decide, is whether or not we write it off in the year and write that down, fees down, or do we store it up like a lot of house builders might do, right, put it against the value of the land, and then either take a big hit 1 year or a big victory, whichever way. We haven't quite got there yet.
Okay.
Thank you, Steve. Steve T, on to Steve A.
Yeah, just to add to that, so I think just echoing what Steve was saying, making the case and internally for an organisation that's largely been used to, when we transact on a deal, you know, immediately we're going to get some kind of certainty or security that there is an asset there that has a value, to something like an option whereby, as Steve said, it's a roll of the dice, and we need to, you know, we have to think about that differently in terms of our organizational appetite and capacity to take the pain of losing that money, but also thinking about, if and when we lose the money, where are we losing the money and how does that trickle through, and what are the consequences from that. So that's kind of back to the structuring and just thinking about how to, you know, how to avoid, for example, any risk to our covenants or unintended cross defaults on loans and that kind of stuff. We really need to make sure that we're setting ourselves up well to, be more entrepreneurial. So I think we're in the foothills of that, but I think that's coming.
Thank you. We're coming up to 11 o'clock. So last few minutes here, if any of the audience have any urgent questions, please do let us know. Duncan Smith?
No, I was just going to come in on the poll earlier. I was really interested in the answer to the section 106 question about driving up the price. And again, controversial as ever from my perspective. I don't think that's anything to do with local authorities. I think that's to do with intermediaries. And from my perspective, it's a bit of a, I don't know, I don't want to use the term dark art, but people getting involved with national house builders promising people that they'll do a service, the housing association pays for that service via fees or attached to an employer's agent or whatever service. And from my perspective, they make organisations competing against each other for the same site, and automatically that drives up the price. But that's been going on, let's be fair, I've been doing this nearly 20 years now. That's been going on since the year dot. And you kind of get into a position sometimes of paying people, no names, no pactol again, 150 grand for sending 3 emails. That's the thing that frustrates me. I've got no problem in local authorities being involved in that process if they've got the money to buy it. But it's, I don't think we're ever going to be able to eradicate that particular process, but I just wanted to chip in with that.
Thank you. Steve Aleppo?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know what the answer is to that, Duncan, but I do agree with you that it happens. And I think as a sector, we need to have a good look at ourselves about the fact that it happens because, again, these are homes that get built anyway, and it's just leaking value from this sector. It's leaking the value of the subsidy that we get and what we could do with that. So I think, unfortunately, in a sector that's got over 1,000 players or maybe 200 plus that are actively developing at some kind of scale, it's going to happen. But I think as a sector we're probably not helping ourselves by what sometimes looks like a bit of a frenzy just to chase numbers rather than really thinking about how much value as a collective we're adding.
Thank you so much.
And that's happening because local authorities are getting stronger and they need to deliver affordable homes in their areas. And I did a bid for a local authority the other day, was out in the sector on a tender, and I put the question to them saying, are we bidding against housing associations here? And the question was yes. And then one looks at it and goes, well, should there be engagement beforehand? Because the land agent is the winner in this. They've got a planning permission agreed at some ridiculous 25%. They're putting it out onto tender, then housing associations and local authorities are bidding against each other to inflate that land value. So is there a collective that one should have with them that you should talk to each other? I know in the private sector days, we did have some kind of understanding, some of the smaller ones, not the national ones, about bidding on stuff. So, that is definitely something to think about.
Thanks a lot. I've got some questions here to work through. So to begin with, Cara Lukes from In Communities. Hello, Cara, we see you a lot. Great to hear from you. Not all housing associations are ethically comfortable or have the financial means to land bank. Do you think where possible this attitude needs to change?
Definitely. Go
Duncan.
I'm not sure about the ethics part of the question. I don't think that causes me any ethical issues whatsoever. It's part of an overall business model. We have commercial subsidiaries, as I don't doubt Steve and Steve do, which are perfectly separate organisations, albeit linked to the main organisation. Land banking is part of an overall strategy of having a pipeline of developable sites that meet the business plan, that meet the strategies that we put in place, and have the flexibility for us that if the market dips, we can flip something from a commercial option into affordable housing. What's not to love about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. There's another question here.
Hang on,
Peter
Chris,
Melvin. Chris.
Steve, what's your thoughts on that quickly?
Yeah, I was just going to say, again, agreeing with Duncan, it's a way of de-risking long-term delivery. So as long as housing associations are looking at land banking through that lens rather than through a kind of speculating to make profit lens, then I think it's perfectly supportable. But you know, back to the question, I think the question mentioned capacity to do it as well. If you don't have the capacity, you shouldn't be doing it.
And exactly, that allows you to have a land team. I've always said to people, I said, well, if you have a land team, you don't have to build every single site. You know, if that allows you to have a team that you can then flip some sites, sell to other sites to other people, and that creates the business of your team. It's a pipeline in sales, isn't it? It's got a bad press because of the private sector, etc., etc. But if it's a pipeline for delivery, you need that, and then you have the option of what you want to do with it. You're in control of the site.
And I think a simple answer is you don't have to buy every piece of land. What we're seeing is the increased use of exclusivity agreements. So you're not paying out for the land, you're paying for exclusivity over a period of time.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. And if you can get your message out about what you're delivering, the landowner or stakeholder is more likely or wanting to have a conversation with you at an earlier stage. It's getting that conversation out. And as long as you can get the numbers to work, and by the way, there's some good appraisal systems that SDS provide. Don't know if anyone has heard of those. Landval, for one, is on the rise.
Shameless.
And ProVal, which is the industry leader, you know.
Okay,
Anyway,
we've got a couple more questions here. Duncan, I know that you need to get on to me, and you can, but I just want to try and
keep going, Chris. I'll stay as long as I can.
He says he enjoys the banter.
So,
there we go.
This one's from Gary Norman. We're finding out that the for-profit guys, Sage and L&Q, will outbid the RP sector by some margin if they want a scheme, no matter how sharp our pencil and relevant market intelligence is.
Yep.
Duncan.
Come up with better ways to squeeze your resources to outbid them, if that's what you want to do, or move on to something else.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, just don't get into competitions you don't want to win or can't win. Don't go down the route of bidding for everything. You'd be absolute lunatics, whoever you are. I'm sorry, not specific to the questioner. Please believe you me. Be absolute lunatics to bid for everything. Don't be more selective. Have a good strategy. Know what works for you, what doesn't. Work in areas where you get the best value. I could go on.
Don't get personally involved. Don't get personally involved. This what happens a lot, and I think it happens more in a social housing movement than the private sector. Don't get personally involved. You've got to let go at a certain level and know where those levels are. Steve has probably got a bit more to say about this. Steve T.
Yeah.
More commercially minded, I would imagine.
Yeah, completely. I mean, what you've got to do is, and it's a lesson I've been learning, teaching to my team for years, is you've got to do what you want to do. You've got to know what you can bid for a site or where you can squeeze yourselves and where you're comfortable with. The moment you go beyond that, you're just storing up problems, because what you're probably doing is cutting corners, which will come back and bite you later. You've decided to cut back on the build by % or two. You've squeezed the margin a bit. Oh, sales, we could get a bit more on that. And then suddenly, as I always say, you've got to have your feet firm on the ground, solid ground. Then you can take a view, but don't cheat yourself into that solid position. Get yourself sorted using Landval, using Val. There you go, Irma Keep. Do that, get your feet on the ground. And then if you want to the site, because for some reason you've got a issue with stock transfer or whatever you've got to deal with, then take a view, but don't take views on views on views.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Can we move on here?
Demonstrations are widely available on Landval. Just pick up the telephone.
Yeah, I would happily do that.
s-d-s.org.
Shameless.
Come on.
Right, I know. Okay, so we've got Robert. One here from Robert. Should we do like the Welsh when it comes to RPs competing on sites? Maybe one from Duncan.
I'm assuming that's a question around zoning of RPs to particular local authorities in Wales, which I haven't worked in Wales for 17 years, so I'm stretching my own knowledge, ladies and gentlemen. But I think that's still the case. Listen, there was a paper that some independent group did to the Welsh Assembly around changing the way that they invest in affordable housing in Wales. And I don't think any of those recommendations in that paper, I can't remember what it's called, have been implemented. I say to my own country, and I mean this most seriously, learn from England. The things that have worked, move away from an economy which is based on restriction rather than openness, and maybe we'll build some more affordable housing in Wales.
Okay, powerful words there. And one more here from Peter Bowden. Chris, are we going to see the SDS mascot again? Yes, the ginger cat. So this is my cat who has made a few appearances. There we go.
Oh, totally enthralled with the content of this webinar.
He's having a nap. He's 17 and he naps a lot.
It looks
So,
like
yes.
you've knocked him out with your kettlebell, Chris.
Yeah.
That's just for show. You
Well,
know,
actually, the kettlebell's turned into a doorstop now, so I haven't swung it in a while, probably a year. Right, I think that's a really great time to end. Thank you, everyone, for all of your engagement, and Steve Aleppo, Steve Trenwith, coming on here to show us your plan and where you are was such a great thing for all of us. So thank you so much. And John Smith, and sorry, John Smith.
John Smith.
You know, if I was a reporter, I would have to resign for getting your last name wrong. I do apologize. And thankfully, I'm not a real reporter. But thank you so much, John Stevens, for coming along today. We'd love to hear your insights. And Duncan Smith, once again, a huge friend of the company and of this webinar series. Thank you so much. I'm going to let you all go now, and I look forward to talking to everyone afterwards.
What we got on next week?
Oh, sorry, look at that, I've done that again. So next week, we are doing the SQL core function. So this is a bit of an open SQL demo. If you already have SQL, you may not be using it correctly, or if you want to know a bit more about SQL, this is the one that we're just gonna sit here and go through the product with you. And then we'll have...
We could show people how you can track your land deals in SQL, and where we can use SQL for tracking that. Because I think it's really important. Shameless. No, it's telling you what we're doing next week.
Well, next week is a blatant open demo. It's not.
Yeah, but we can show people how it's important to track that land position as soon as you identify it. Use the key attributes in SQL to track that to a position to get to your stage. You know, and a lot more clients we're working with, who are doing that process. And Duncan is definitely on board with that as an example. Nodding, Duncan, thank you.
Yeah.
Next week.
And after that, 2 weeks break for Easter, and then we're going to be back, and I'm going to have what's going to look like a newsroom broadcast with multi-camera control and broadcast style graphics on a Zoom webinar. So I cannot wait for that.
And Homes England. We're having Homes England. Well,
I cannot wait. Wow. After 1 year of no debates, we finally got a yes. I am just
strong debate.
Amazed, and I cannot wait for that. That's going to be a great one. Okay,
Thanks
right.
for your time, guys. Thanks
Look
for your time,
out for the confirmation of that. Take it easy. Everyone have a great week.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.